All right. Well, welcome, Ellen. I'm so glad we finally made it.
Me too.
It's been a few weeks in planning and rescheduling, and I appreciate your patience. And I'm just really excited for this conversation. This book, you and I didn't know each other prior to this. We were connected by a mutual friend of ours, Holly Whitaker. Um, but we speak a lot of the same language, and we
Mm.
talk about anxiety very similarly. And it always excites me to see we need to hear the things we need to hear multiple times in multiple ways from multiple teachers, right? We can't hear it often enough. So your book, The Anatomy of Anxiety, which is so beautiful. And like I said, this is what I what I do. I'm such a nerd. Understanding and overcoming the body's fear response. This came out it was last March. Yeah.
Yeah, basically a year ago.
Yeah. So we're just kind of celebrating its birthday and
Yeah.
talking about it today. We'll get into, there's some bigger themes in your book that I wanted to touch on. One of the first, of course, is this idea about true and false anxiety. I have used my students and listeners will remember me talking about like clean and dirty pain.
Mm.
And it's kind of like let's dig into it. Let's talk about this false sense of anxiety because this is what's mostly running rampant. And I think mostly what we talk about, right? When we talk about anxiety, there's something on page, this is like towards the beginning, you talk about true emotions, how they occur when something steeply challenging has happened. Something like, and you give solid examples, a family member passes away and you're grieving. Maybe you lose your job and you're stressed. Maybe you're going through a breakup and you're sad. These are genuine responses, right, to real difficulties that we encounter in life. So that's the true side. Let's talk about the false side for a second.
Yeah.
How that comes up.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's the part that's really running rampant. I mean, we have an honest claim to both these days, but the way I think about it, and I'm forever wordsmithing how to describe it, because false anxiety, that term, is understandably so triggering, because anyone who struggles is like, what do you mean my anxiety is false? And it doesn't feel good. So a really important caveat is that it in no way is meant to invalidate the very real suffering. It just speaks to the fact that there is a straightforward cause and a path out. And so false anxiety is physical anxiety. And it's also, really importantly, avoidable anxiety. It's based in the
Yes.
physical body, and it occurs when something has tipped our body into a stress response. And we subjectively experience that stress response as anxiety. But if we could peek under the hood, if we could omnisciently see what's going on in that moment, even though our mind is always quick to tell us a story about why we're anxious, it says, okay, I suddenly feel anxious. And it's because of this thing going on at work, this overwhelm, this fear about the future, and this interpersonal dynamic from the seventh grade that still irks me. That is our brain being the meaning maker that it is. But it's actually swooping in to tell us a story to justify what is first and foremost a physical sensation, which is that the body is in a stress response. And what actually caused the stress response is usually something pretty mundane in our modern lives. Maybe we're in a blood sugar crash, maybe we're sleep deprived, we could be inflamed, something could be off in our digestive tract, we could be hungover or over caffeinated, we could be getting our period the next day, which is sort of a unique, not quite true, not quite false anxiety moment, which we can unpack a bit.
Yes.
And so that's false anxiety. It's basically this avoidable anxiety that doesn't need to be happening. And we can identify and address the cause of it and eliminate a lot of unnecessary suffering.
Yes. Yes. It starts spinning out, right? When we it's like we detect this little glimmer of anxiety. And like you said, our minds are such meaning makers. Like humans
Mm,
are natural born storytellers.
yeah.
So we're gonna tell a story about it. And if we fall asleep and we aren't conscious of or um managing the story that we're telling, right? Our mind is going to tell us all kinds of nonsense.
Yeah.
And if we start falling for that, then we start this snowball momentum, right? well, I felt this little glimmer of something that kind of looked or kind of felt like anxiety, but maybe had nothing to do with that even whatsoever. Or it was like you're talking about this sense of these triggers. You talked about downstream effects of anxiety, right? Of like, I've just been on Twitter too long. I've just had too many cups of coffee. I just didn't sleep last night. And it's like it's not real. We don't have to treat it with the gravity, right? We can just say, oh, I need to read the room. I need to remember the context of this
Mm.
moment.
The gravity is such an interesting dimension of all of this, because I've been noticing in the zeitgeist right now, people are, and even not right now, this was a year ago, people were putting out memes on social media that were saying, I have to take my stupid walk for my stupid mental health. And right
I
now
remember.
we're in a moment now where people are saying like, I hate to break it to you, but I tried the healthier eating and the earlier bedtime and the exercise, and I deeply apologize, but I'm ashamed to say it worked. And so it's so interesting that we are frustrated with the fact that holistic diet and lifestyle strategies help our mental health. And I think for a lot of justifiable reasons, it's a little insulting, honestly, to feel called out. I remember one time I was snapping at everybody around me, and my friend pointed out, like, Ellen, author of the literal book that talks about this, could it be the fact that you picked coffee back up as a habit? I was like, no, everyone's terrible. What are you talking about? I was in false irritability. And so it feels a little bit like we feel a little foolish. We feel called out, but also we've been so taught to think of mental health as high tech, and of course it has so much gravity. It's the lens through which we experience the world, and it can create immense amounts of suffering. And so to think of it as something that can be remedied, something so low tech and simple, it feels like insulting to the problem and out of proportion to the gravity of the issue. But it actually ends up being that even though mental health creates very high tech problems, the solution is sometimes very low tech.
Yes. And the simpler, the better, right?
Mm.
This is, I remember again, towards the beginning of the book, there was this, you laid it out so simply, these stats about how anxiety has skyrocketed. And it's like, I know when I feel anxiety in my body, and I tell this story to some of my students about, I was feeling really, really anxious. And my mom, this was way back when I was single and lived in an apartment in the city. And my mom had come down to be with me and kind of talk me down and just be with me while I was having this, I was stressed about work. And so we were getting together. Anyway, she said, why don't you come back to the house for dinner and let's make sure that you're fed, and then we'll get our evening underway. Well, when we went to go back to her house, the battery in her car had died. And so we were like, oh, okay, so my mom can't handle this. So I'm in charge now of figuring out how we're going to jump the car and everything. By the end of it, I wasn't feeling anxious anymore,
Mm.
which is fascinating, because if the anxiety were real, like if I had had influenza, there would have been no amount of jumping a car that would have distracted me from the fact that I had the flu, and I wouldn't have felt any better. Probably I would have felt worse at the end of that whole rigmarole. But it was fascinating to me. And it's a story I tell because it just so succinctly like highlights that by the time the car was jumped, I was like, I'm good.
It's so interesting. And it draws on so many themes of anxiety, that so much of it is future tripping, uncertainty, control, and really this anticipation of something might happen in the future that I won't be able to handle. So anytime we have an experience where we witness ourselves handling a difficult situation and we get that dose of self-efficacy, it is quite a nice salve to our anxiety, because we start to learn, not only am I immensely capable of even unpredictable challenges that come down the pipeline, but it starts to inform the fact that, well, what could come down the pipeline that I wouldn't be able to handle? And it's not to say life isn't going to throw us massive challenges. We both know it certainly does.
Mhm.
And we can always put one foot in front of the other, do the next right thing, and handle it. And like a really important asterisk around handling it, doesn't mean like the boomer generation's idea of like buck up and, stay calm and don't cry, handle it. Like it means like sometimes handling it is having an enormous cathartic release, a big cry and asking for help, a big emotional outpouring. Handling it has to do with very strongly flowing with our emotions. But it's the fact that in Chinese medicine, there's this analogy of a bamboo tree that sways with the breeze. You sway towards the anger, the sadness, the overwhelm, the grief, the ecstasy, and you come back to your center point. And that's handling it. You sway deeply and you're flexible enough that you can come back to the center.
Yeah. Yeah. I love this. I remind my people often, handling it doesn't mean it has to be pretty.
Mm.
It doesn't mean you do it gracefully or that you did it perfectly or that it felt good. Because so far, all of us, we're all here, you're listening to this, 100% of the time, you've handled it. Some of that has been a total disaster, right? Some of it has been a hot mess where you look back and you're like, God, that's kind of embarrassing, really. Sure. Who cares? Right? We've handled it. That's part of, I love that image, that visual of the bamboo tree being fluid enough to sway, right? And resilient enough to return to like that set point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like the simplest approach. I love what you're saying about it's almost insulting, but there's really simple stuff. Sometimes you just need to jump a car.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just need a glass of water or a hug or a nap.
Or a
And
snack or a cry.
yes.
Yeah.
And I know it can seem a little like, do you understand how I'm feeling? This is a really big deal. And it doesn't have to be a big deal to solve. And it's usually, I have found, typically completely under our control, which I think is great news.
For me, false anxiety draws a lot upon the skills I've learned by the trial by fire of parenting. And I remember in the early days when I had my daughter, it was almost like I needed to keep a list on the refrigerator. Why is she cranky right now? Is she overtired? Is she hungry? Do we need to change her diaper? Does she just need to be burped? Is she teething? These sort of things that for whatever reason, I could only keep 3 of them in my mind. And every once in a while, I would forget the one that actually was the one that applied in that moment. And false anxiety, it kind of recognizes the fact that we as adults are in so many ways oversized toddlers. And we also sometimes need a snack, need a nap, but sometimes we need a cathartic release of our emotions. We take on a lot. I think about my daughter's meltdowns, and meltdowns are unpleasant for all involved. It's hard to see your kid so sad. It's hard to like deal with this happening in public or this happening on the way to school. And you're just like, I'm trying to get through life and it's in the way. But really, I look at it as like she is going through life having to learn. She's learning math. She's learning how to be a person in the world. She's learning social relationships. And her brain is developing at this rapid rate. It's just a lot on a human being. And sometimes there needs to be an explosive release. And we adults need that too. And we have quite a bit of cultural conditioning telling us to not let those releases happening. And we've been told, don't cry. If we cry, we apologize and we try to suck it back in and make it smaller and quicker. And so we're missing a lot of the release that our nervous systems need.
Yeah. It's so interesting. If you see somebody crying, what's your first question? It's like, what's wrong? Something must be wrong. Right? I've really tried to correct myself to say what happened, what's happening for you, right?
Yeah.
To invite in, maybe it's a release, maybe it's neutral.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something great happening here. I don't know. But why do we need to lead with that, right? And then you're exactly right. Then when somebody asks, when we're crying and somebody says inevitably, what's wrong? And we say, oh, I'm sorry, nothing. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. Yeah. Obviously. You're not. And it's okay. And all of this is part of what it is to be human, fully human.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, this is a little bit related. I talk to my students a lot about making their environment safe. I think again, if we kind of go to sleep mentally, it can be very easy to look at social media and the headlines and the news and just what's happening in the world and say, are you insane? The world is not a safe place. Nothing is safe. Everything is completely out of control. But we have to intentionally, deliberately, purposefully remind ourselves. It's like for the one car crash that we hear about, how many millions of people got to work just fine, right? For the one time that like your romaine had salmonella or whatever it is that happens with lettuce, right? That it's like how many millions of meals have been safe, have been right. There's been no food poisoning. Reminding ourselves how safe the world is and purposefully making our environments safe. This isn't even just recognizing the safety that's inherent around us, but that we can purposefully create and remind ourselves that the world is safe. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that, because I think it's an important reminder when it's so easy to default to the no, it's not.
I have like a fourfold reflection on this. So let's see if I can
Okay.
keep my thoughts in order. I mean, first is that I think, especially right before bed, I do think it's critical to feel surrounded by safety and not by danger, because that's sort of part of the mechanism of how we surrender into a state of sleep. And then sleep, in turn, decreases anxiety. If we can sleep well, we are much less prone to anxiety the next day. And to sleep well, we need to feel surrounded by safety. In this modern environment, if we're doom scrolling late at night, we feel surrounded by danger. Our brains did not evolve to triage the fact that we used to be able to be aware of the goings on of about 125 people. And now we're able to be aware of everything that's going on in every pocket of the world at all times. And it's more information than our brains know how to make sense of in terms of what's probabilistic and what's going to impact us. And especially if you're empathic, you're just taking it all on. I think we also have to be aware of the fact that I call this in my book the banality of fear. But it has to do with the fact that we are living right now in the attention economy, which is to say that our attention is the commodity being competed for by very smart companies. And they know their neuroscience and their behavioral psychology. And they know that if they prey on our fear response or instill uncertainty or doubt or controversy, we will rubberneck, we will hand over an increasingly large share of our attention. They get more clicks, they sell more products, they get more ad revenue, but our mental health is often the collateral damage. So we need to be navigating this information landscape with our eyes wide open from a very self-loving place, not falling prey to every time somebody is trying to sell us something, whether it's a product we don't need or just more time with our eyeballs on their service, on their platform. We just need to be aware of when it's happening and sometimes put up a little force field energetically. It's telling us to be afraid, and we need to check in with ourselves. Should I really internalize that fear, or is this somebody trying to sell me something I don't need?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. That FOMO, right? We're always like the fear of missing out, the fear of not fitting in, the fear of not belonging. And I mean, we can see it everywhere. There's a reason that we feel compelled to buy things we don't need, that we forget about by the time they arrive.
Yeah.
Right. Isn't that the
Yeah.
best when something arrives and it's like, I don't even know. Oh, good. She's brought socks too. For those of you on video, Poppy's here. Yeah,
Love.
it is. And say a little bit more too about this tie with, I talk to a lot of people who are anxious about sleep. And again, this is one of those, another one of those negative spin cycles we can get in.
Yeah.
They're anxious about not getting enough sleep. And then they're not getting enough sleep. So they're feeling more anxiety.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love what you're
Sleep.
saying about creating a really safe, like setting yourself up for safety before you even fall asleep.
Sleep in my book, I insisted on having it be one of the early chapters because I think, if someone doesn't make it further into my book, if they just get through the sleep chapter, they've changed their life. And
Yes.
it's such an important topic. I think that a couple thoughts on this. One is that we do a lot of talking about how we don't sleep well because of our anxiety. And that's valid. Anxiety does impact sleep for sure. But what we fail to recognize is that our sleep, in turn, it's a bidirectional relationship. Sleep impacts anxiety, and it's actually the easier place to start. So I say fix your sleep and watch that improve your anxiety rather than focusing first on fixing your anxiety and hoping that that fixes your sleep. And you're exactly right that when we overthink sleep, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and we're really worked up and we psych ourselves out and it becomes hard to fall asleep. So I think a really important conceit or just way to think about sleep is that your body actually wants to sleep and it knows how to sleep. So this is a system that you can trust. But the reason it hasn't necessarily been working up until now is that the body works well for sleep when it gets a certain set of conditions and inputs, and when there's nothing irritating the system or getting in the way. And in the modern environment, there's a lot that it's just normal right now to give our brain all the helter-skelter signals that are exactly the perfect conditions for insomnia. And so we can get strategic and set our brains up to sleep better. And the place to start is light. Light is the primary cue for our circadian rhythm. And it's the part that modern environment has been it's the most dysregulated at this point, because rather than being outdoors in the broad daylight during the day, waking up with the sun, and then being surrounded by reliable darkness in the evening, these days we are indoors under fluorescent lighting during the day and then surrounded by a psychedelic light show of phones and laptops and iPads and overhead lighting during the evening. So it's sending these inputs, basically, especially that after sunset light, it's going into our brain, to a part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it's telling it, good morning, the sun just rose, even if we're just scrolling on our phone at 11:45 p.m. So we want to get really strategic about what light our eyes are seeing. And the two most important signals are first thing in the morning, figuring out some way to get actual sunshine into your actual eyeballs. And that starts the clock and ticks in the background so that you can get sleepy at night. And then to make sure that after sunset, you're getting some experience of darkness, whether that means you power down electronics, dim the overhead lighting, maybe you throw your phone into the ocean and move off the grid and homestead and raise chickens, it's up to you. Or you could just get blue blocking glasses, which is a really good harm reduction strategy. And you just block out blue spectrum light with those glasses. And that way you're protecting your circadian rhythm. It makes it a lot easier to sleep. There are other tricks. There's a lot we can do to support sleep, but that's a really good place to start.
Yeah. And again, make it simple. Focus on light to focus on sleep, right? That it doesn't have to be a really dramatic, time consuming. I feel like there's some resistance sometimes when people really get serious about transforming their relationship with anxiety and really making changes in their life, not just thinking about it, right? Not just reading a book or listening to a podcast, but implementing and living into it. There's some resistance to, it's going to be either this huge change and I don't have the time, the money, the effort, like I'm just not interested, right? And I love all throughout the book and it's like, take what works, right? Start anywhere and just implementing something super, super simple. You're doing it anyway. Just do it a little bit differently or eliminate it, which is even better. It's not really more to do. It can be less to do.
Right. Yeah.
Which is a beautiful thing. We all need that. For sure.
That's one of the principles, is like, where can we start to say no and do less? And I really love all of the conversation that's happening these days around boundaries. I love Melissa Urban's book, The Book of Boundaries.
Yes.
And like just how we start to recognize, I like the nonviolent communication wording of this too, like your true yes and your true no. And I realized I was giving out my false yes all the time. Someone would say, can you take on this project? Do you want to do this thing with me? Do you want to get coffee? And because you don't want to disappoint people, or you want to please people, or you want to avoid a confrontation, I would say, okay, sure. and then I would resent the other person or feel overwhelmed. And I've started to give out my true no, which of course feels super uncomfortable. But in Brene Brown's words, I think she says, clear is kind.
Yes.
And nobody wants to be resented. Like the person I was reluctantly saying yes to a coffee with, I don't want to put the person in that position. I don't want someone to say yes to me out of obligation. And so just to start to give our true yes or no. And that means that we're doing less, especially we're doing less that's out of alignment for us.
Yeah. I like to remember too, every time I say yes, there's an equal and opposite no, usually to myself and my time, right? And if I say no to the coffee, to the project, I'm getting an equal and opposite yes, which again is usually, oh, I get this evening back,
Yeah.
right? Or I'm not doing that project. So all of that headspace or effort or energy or meetings or deadlines, I get all of that back.
Yeah.
So when we remember, I think sometimes that short little NO, which is a complete sentence, that word, it comes with a lot of negativity. But when we remember that it's like there's that yes on the underside of it, what are you also saying yes to when you say the no? Right?
And I can almost hear one person like thinking to themselves, well, but if I say no to the project, I'm saying yes to just doing nothing, but I won't use that time productively. So I'll
Oh,
just
yeah.
be lazy. And I think that's where it's so important to have massive cultural course correction, which I love the Taoist principle of this, to look at the yin yang and recognize that yang, the masculine sun doing productivity energy, exists in a perfect dynamic equilibrium with yin energy, moon,
Yes.
feminine, receptive, non doing rest energy. That there is no better or worse, that these exist in a balance. And we are in a moment where very yang and balanced. We are obsessed with yang. That's what we value, and we devalue yin. So if you're saying no to something else and yes to more time at rest, that's not any less worthy in any way. That we actually have to
Mhm.
recognize the inherent worth of rest and to protect it fiercely.
Yeah. It's a question. This is something to just kind of consider as you're maybe considering the yeses and the nos that you're putting out, is why you personally, you individually value productivity and going and doing and being out in the world, the external yang, power, aggression, control, why you value that, you for yourself, more than you value rest, relaxation. And this doesn't always need to look like you sitting on the couch alone, chilling out. This can easily be like a longer meal with friends that you just have space for because you don't have to rush off to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. It could be reading a book outside. It could be
Mm.
getting your toes in the dirt. I mean, there's so many different ways that it doesn't have to look like you're horizontal doing nothing or you're totally outside of the world. You can still be very engaged and and be with that more yin, restful, restorative energy,
Yeah.
right? But really valuing that, I think is tricky because
Yeah.
like you said, we're surrounded by cultural and societal messaging that really glorifies the power yang, going, doing side of the world. And like look around, I don't think it's working.
Mm. I imagine some people are also apprehensive around losing their momentum of go, go, go,
Mm,
because they rightly think that if they stopped and rested, there'd be so much inertia to that, it would be really hard to like pick it back up.
yeah.
And I think that that's also something to be reckoned with, is that some of us are really in a moment of like soul rebellion against our productivity. And if we gave that an inch, I think it would take a mile, but that might be right for us.
Yeah.
Because we are a bit like running on fumes and running from it. You know, we're running on our own inertia with our productivity hustle culture. And if we
Mhm.
stop to reflect on that, or if there's any pattern disruption to it, it starts to seem like maybe we shouldn't go back to that. And then we worry, will we pay the bills? Are we worthy? Who will celebrate us? Are we worthy of love? You know, all those questions come in. And so I think that, to me, like real productivity comes when we're rested, when
Yeah.
we recognize our value and our needs are met and we're safe, but then also when it's our art, you know, on some level, it's our
Mhm.
truth that we're contributing to the world. And that's tough in the modern corporate environment. And so I think we have really big, difficult questions to figure out around that, how we can make our contribution, earn a living, and be in alignment all at the same time.
Yeah.
and rested.
Yeah. And I try to view, I know you're very involved in the yoga world as well. And I practice yoga every morning and meditate most days. Yeah, meditation to me is not as interesting as yoga because there's more of a doing to yoga. Like it makes sense, right? Um, but this, like, what were you just saying? I totally lost my train of thought right before I launched into the yoga thing.
There was a whole thing about souls rebelling against our productivity in our jobs.
Yes. And our corporate, oh, I know where I was going with this, is
Mhm.
that it's a practice.
Mhm.
And instead of us really, I feel like most of us, like, we try to march through the day as if this is the way that it is. And if every once in a while, I mean, a few times a year even, pause and it's like zoom way out. And can I ask, like, what's working? What's not working? What do I need to do differently here? Could I
Mhm.
get some perspective on this and treat work, treat parenting, treat health, treat relationships as if they are the practices they are, right? They're not static. They're not permanent. They're not like, well, once I have figured this out, I'm good,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? It's always changing. I mean, parenting is the best example of this probably because as soon as you figure it out, they start walking and they start talking and they start eating solid foods and then they start going to school and then they turn into teenagers, which is what's happening in my household. It's like as soon as you find some ground, it's going to change. So treating it all as like, I'm just practicing being a mom, right? There's
Parenthood
some,
really is the ultimate beginner's mind humility
isn't
maker.
it? And I think my mom would say the same, right? That she's like, we're not done yet. Just because you're out of the house and on your own and have kids of your own, it doesn't mean that for her, parenting is like, okay, like there's still a practice there. There's still a relationship of how do parents and adult children relate,
Yeah.
right? Parents and grandchildren. And yeah, it always change. It is beginner's mind. Crash course over and over. Okay, something that I know a lot of people, this was one of the first chapters that I read in your book. I skipped around because I had to read this chapter I just wanted to read it first, is about women and hormones and anxiety. And I
Mm.
can't even tell you how many women I talk to, especially as they get into their 40s, who they've gotten to be pretty well in sync with, here's how different weeks of my cycle feel physically, perhaps, but also emotionally. And they're noticing they're becoming more and more. I don't know if this is an age thing, if it's an experience thing, if we're like, oh, this isn't my first rodeo with this, but the correlation between anxiety and where we're at in our cycle. And you mentioned this earlier that it's like right on the knife edge of true false, right? That it's like you get this hint that something's happening and it's not completely, like, we can't eradicate that. There's some honoring of that, but also a
Mhm.
working with.
Exactly. Yeah. So much to be said on this. And it's interesting because I'm
Yeah.
more perimenopausal now than I was when I wrote the book. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so I even understand it better from inside. So I think there's a couple of considerations here. One is actually even just things like exogenous hormones that we take, things like birth control. And that deserves a conversation, just for anyone who, you know, might still be taking exogenous hormones and suspect it might play a role in their anxiety. And I just want to make sure that if anyone is still unclear about whether that could be contributing, because I know that when we bring that information to our prescribers, sometimes there's some gaslighting around that, like, no, that's not what the evidence shows. And I know I got that response when I went back to my gynecologist and was like, okay, it's great that my skin is clear, but like I think I'm crying every day. You know, is this okay? And she's like, oh yeah, that can't be the pill. And so I think that, you know, you just seem stressed, sweetie. And so I think it's really, I have a bee in my bonnet about that. We do now decades later have the data, which is that of course exogenous hormones contribute to depression and anxiety levels. There's a lot of minutia to that data. If we're taking them at younger ages, it seems to have an even more enduring and significant impact. So we just need to be having this conversation. It's not to say no one should be on exogenous hormones. It's on the menu, but we deserve informed consent. We need to know all the considerations. Then let's talk about like your sort of 40 something woman. Maybe she's had kids already. Maybe she's even using something like fertility awareness method or condoms. And at this point, she's actually very tuned into her cycle. She's not on exogenous hormones, but there's like 5 days of the month where she feels great. And the rest of the time,
Yes.
it's an
Why is
adventure.
it that way?
And then the joys of perimenopause, that it becomes like predictably unpredictable too. Just when you figured out your cycle, just when you figured it out.
Impermanence again. Yes.
It's like, I now finally have healed my PCOS. I have a clockwork cycle and I am syncing, and I'm syncing my life with it and practicing fertility awareness method. And I know when I'm in my follicular phase, I know when I'm ovulating, I know when I'm luteal, and I'm really working with this. And it's like, surprise, here comes perimenopause. And it's all a crapshoot again.
No, you don't.
But I think that here's the thing about the luteal phase, because that's the one worth focusing on. That's the second half of our cycle where our hormones are starting to wane as we head into the bleeding phase of our cycle. And that's usually when we'll see an uptick in irritability, tearfulness, sadness, anxiety, for some people, even like heavy, darker thoughts. And so that's where I think there is a component of false and a component of true anxiety. The false anxiety is that many of us these days have an exaggerated PMS experience, and it has to do with the fact that the modern environment bathes us in endocrine disruptors. So we are exposed through pesticides, plastics, personal care products, makeup, perfume, cleaning products, like fabric softeners, air pollution. It's all around us, but we're exposed, and like birth control residue in our tap water. We're exposed to things that behave like estrogen in our bodies. So if the ratio to estrogen to progesterone is supposed to be a certain interval, it gets blown out of proportion because we have an excess of estrogen. And then at the same time, our progesterone levels are falsely lowered, partly because we're not that well nourished. We've villainized dietary cholesterol, which is a critical building block of the sex hormones. And then we are chronically stressed, which there's a concept that we at least were taught in med school, whether it's actually this simple or not, I'm not sure, called pregnenolone steal, which is that this precursor called pregnenolone is what our body uses to make progesterone, but it also happens to be the precursor for cortisol, our stress hormone. So when we're chronically stressed, the body steals the pregnenolone and uses it to make cortisol day in, day out, and never has enough to make sufficient quantities of progesterone. So if you think about it, rather than a certain interval of estrogen to progesterone, we have heightened levels of estrogen and decreased levels of progesterone. And I believe that contributes to the even more, it just makes our PMS phase more pronounced and exaggerated. So that's the false component. But importantly, there's also a true component, because I'm done with the cultural messaging around the fact that when you're PMSing, you're a bitch, or you're irrational, or you're being unreasonable. And actually, I think there's truth serum to the luteal phase. Like, what is the real truth? Is it how we see things when we're follicular and we're like, oh, this big problem in the world? It's fine. Or how we are in our luteal phase when we're like, this is the worst thing imaginable and I want to murder everyone in my family. So
I love
think that
this dichotomy. This is such an interesting way to, which side is true?
I think we may never really know the truth until we're well into the postmenopausal years, but I think that it's just something to give ourselves at least some grace around that. Yeah, we might need to let our partner know, like, can you be a little bit more patient with me, or I need a little bit of space, or I need a little bit of support. I'm feeling raw, I'm feeling vulnerable, I'm feeling irritable. But also to give ourselves permission to have those indignant feelings of this is not okay, because I think there's actually quite a lot of truth to what comes up in our luteal phase.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, this is, I think the more, again, it's one of these, like, the more we know, I try to teach, I don't, well, a lot of people come and they're like, I have been reading everything about anxiety. I know all about, and I'm like, that is the last thing you need. Like, you could write the books on anxiety at this point, right? We need more of what you want in your life. We need more research that way. And we need to move in a direction of crowding this thing that you don't want, right? This relationship that isn't working out with things that you do want, right? Connection, joy, steadiness, groundedness, peace, fulfillment, worth, satisfaction. But it's an interesting too. There's, again, just to be contradictory, because there's a lot to be said for just simply being aware of what's happening, the power of that kind of awareness of like, oh, it's this day. Here's where I'm at in my cycle. This is what's happening. I have not lost my mind. Anxiety's not here to stay. This is another one I hear all the time. Now this is just how I'm going to live my life. I'm permanently anxious.
Yeah.
It will cycle through. It's all part of it. And keeping that, it's not even a belief, it's a fact. It's like keeping that in our minds at the forefront so that we don't lose the plot when things start feeling a little unsteady or irritable, or we just notice that we're a little more prone to anxiety.
I love what you're bringing up. And I've never really thought about it this way before, but there's such a both and to how we want to hold a loose grip on our current narrative, like our going hypothesis for life in any given moment. There's a Ram Dass clip that I'll often listen to where he repeats over and over, I am loving awareness. I am loving awareness. I am loving awareness. And just to sort of think about that from every angle of the prism. And I think that I actually push back a little bit on, there's a section in my book, it's all about feminism and all this, but I kind of call into question CBT. I connect it back to Holly Whitaker's book, Quit Like a Woman, where she's like, okay, so just a couple thoughts on AA. And I mean, I have so many patients helped by AA. I don't fundamentally disagree with it, but she brings up such an important point, which is that, to say that you've made mistakes, to hand over your power, to sort of right size yourself and realize you're not God. She's like, that's just what it is to go through life as a woman. That's what made me sick. That's not what's going to heal me from substance abuse. And I think that in the same way, I think CBT is an interesting example where, I've trained in CBT. I use CBT principles with patients. I've known so many people helped so dramatically from it. But I've always just felt a little uncomfortable with the idea of telling you, like, don't believe everything you feel and think, and to sort of push back on our feelings. And to me, that feels so phenotypically masculine, to be more objective, where actually sometimes I think what's healing is to really fully feel our feelings and to give ourselves permission to believe our feelings, to not feel like we need to be pressured out of believing how our body feels. So I think it's always like a both and here, where you want to fully feel everything. You can try it on as a going hypothesis and keep a loose grip and make sure you're just always checking in to recognize, are you seeing a situation through some kind of tinted lens? And to just keep enhancing the awareness and to really love that process.
Yes. And it kind of harkens back to that, like, treat it all as a practice, remain curious. It's all impermanent, right? If we can stay with those skills, those ways of approaching that, because life is contradictory. It's very gray. It is a both and holding two seemingly opposing truths at the same time. Like, we humans are pretty complicated and sophisticated. We've all had the sensation of feeling joy about something and deep loss in the same, if not exact same moment, in the same breath, and the same situation. And that extrapolates out into so much of what we experience, and anxiety is certainly one of those roller coasters. There's a lot of both and. And I like what you're saying with the true and the false here, that there's elements of both. Be willing to look for both.
And I guess just to round out that explanation, we did a pretty good treatment of what is false anxiety, avoidable anxiety, but then we have our true anxiety, which It's actually, it's purposeful anxiety. It's not something to pathologize. It's not something that we get to decaf coffee our way out of. It's just our inner compass nudging us and telling us, that something is out of alignment here. And it can be in our personal lives, in our communities, how we're showing up for people that we love. It could be an activism cause on the larger scale. And it's just basically this little electric fence nudging us back on course. It's telling us something that we secretly deep down know, which is time to course correct, time to show up in a different way. And I think that once we hear it and honor its message, so it's really a communication from the body. It can't speak in words. It speaks in these feelings and the uneasiness. But once we honor the message, we no longer feel mired in anxiety. It starts to feel like we're imbued with purpose.
Yes. Yes. I sometimes joke that my job as a teacher is to just hand out permission slips. Years ago, somebody was like, I think Kelly just like gets online and gives advice to people. I was like, oh, no. I have no advice. I know nothing. I do believe my students know. And if I can ask the right questions or sit with them long enough, they'll come to what they know. And my job is just to like shine a flashlight on that over and over and over again and remember, right? And what kind of permission slips can I give you to want what you want? Right?
I love that. I love even just the word permission and everything that comes with that. So I think about there's a naturopathic principle, which is don't suppress the body's urges. Like the original permission slip that I think of is like, can I use the bathroom? Can I go down the hall and use the bathroom right now? And I think about like, we need to be giving ourselves permission to not suppress our body's urges. Like if you have to pee, pee. If you have to burp or sneeze or cry, let that flow. But then also these other permission slips of the body's urges when it's the nudge of your true anxiety saying something feels uneasy right now. Can we pay attention to this and can we honor the message of it?
Yes. And it's something, this is one of those, the big similarities in our work that jumped out at me is that we're not, I tell people this all the time, we're not looking to get rid of anxiety. It's not going to happen. Right. So sorry. But if we can learn to work with it, if we can learn to listen to it, and people will tell me, it feels like it's getting worse. Like, yeah, your body's having to yell louder. You're not listening. Of course, it's quote unquote getting worse. It's feeling louder. It's feeling more intense. It's time to listen. Yeah. And if we can sift through and discern and sort through the messages that we're hearing, and again, it's a practice, right? We have to be willing to like, okay, maybe I go down this path. And then we see, now what? How am I feeling? What's happening? Right? We may have to backtrack and maybe like, absolutely. Hell yes, you figured it out. But checking in with that to see, this is my body's way of communicating to me. Nothing has gone wrong here. In fact, things are going extremely right when we're able to communicate to ourselves and to pause and listen, right? And then use the messages that we're hearing.
A couple quick thoughts on this, because yes, we have so much overlap in how we think about this. And in my book, I call it the body whisperer. It's like it's initially whispering to us, but most of us miss that. We miss the whisper.
We blow right past that.
And then we're having a panic attack, or we're just like completely incapacitated, and that's the body shouting. But I think about this. One patient said to me years ago, this thing that I still think about all the time, which is, she was like, it feels like the work that she was doing with me, it felt like couples therapy between her and her body.
I loved this story.
And it's a communication. And can we get better and better at listening and respecting? And I think about, like, we were just on vacation a couple of weeks ago. We were in LA, and one night, my husband and I, we had a babysitter. We were putting our daughter to sleep and we were going to go out. And What we didn't realize was that she was feeling like really unseen, unappreciated, like she
Mm,
hadn't gotten her cup filled with time with us, and she was not letting us leave. So
yeah.
it was this moment where at first we were in resistance. We're kind of like, no, we have plans, we have a babysitter, we paid for the babysitter, like this is happening.
Yeah.
And then it became a real opportunity for repair. It's that rupture repair thing, which anytime there is like this big communication of, here's an inconvenient truth that you didn't want to know, it's such an opportunity to be like, well, that was always true, I just was unaware of it before. Let's, now
Yes.
that it's out in the open, we can work with this. And it's been a framing that I'm still, it's vitally informing every day. My interactions with my daughter ever since is like to really help her feel her cup is much more full, on
Yeah.
that, like I'm here and that I see her and that I'm attuned to her. So it's, I think that we need that couples therapy with our bodies. And once we start listening and once we catch
Mhm.
the communications a little bit earlier and we attune to our body's needs and respect our body's needs, I think it's a repair in that relationship. And I do think we go through life with less suffering.
Yeah. That's such a beautiful example too. It's so concrete and it's so relatable.
Mm.
This moment where you're like, "We're headed out. See you later, sister." She's like, "No,
She fell asleep with her arms wrapped around my neck. Anytime I would move, she'd say, "No, mama, no."
it's not
Yeah.
subtle, right?"
And it was fair. It was fair.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Okay, I'm curious to take a left turn, and this is like we're just gonna go unscripted now because we were kind of riffing on this before we started recording. We both were like, we should talk about this. So we'll just see what happens. But I told you, and a lot of my students know, this is the year I'm kind of treating pretty much everybody I come into contact with, honestly, as a guinea pig to test out this idea that perhaps the opposite of anxiety isn't what we usually think of, which is calm or peace or even just being okay, right? Some sense of neutrality, happiness, feeling good. But maybe the opposite is honesty, right? And you and I both were like, it's so fun to kind of consider and talk about. And I don't just mean those big, blatant, outright lies. I'm talking about, in fact, I maybe not even that at all. More about this insidious stuff of just like being like a little bit out of alignment with who we are. Right? You talked earlier about, "Hey, do you want to get a coffee, Ellen?" And you're like, "Yeah." And it's a small thing. Maybe it's 30 minutes on a Tuesday, but you start adding those up and consider how grossly out of alignment you get with how you want to spend your time, your energy, what you wanted to do with your Tuesday. And it's like I didn't lie to anybody when I said yes. I'm fine with coffee. I like this person. But it wasn't, again, that true yes for me, that fully, like there's like that cosmic click in your gut where you're like, yes, this feels really good and really right. And all of these just little untruths that stack up and create anxiety. So I'm curious what you think.
I mean, I'm like, the earth is shaking beneath me as you say this. I think it's so interesting. And, I think everything you're saying, like that when we're a little bit out of alignment, feels very, like, to me, that just is, the story writes itself. That's such a clear path to anxiety. And I wonder if there's also even subtler ways that the opposite of anxiety is honesty. I think about, it's also about honoring our body's needs, and how
Oh,
when
yeah.
when we when we say we're fine, like we witness ourselves lying, when we um, when we're in any kind of social pressure situation, and we basically like swallow our truth to keep the peace or to stay liked or whatever it is. And sometimes we even have to do it to stay safe, but it still
Sure.
kind of adds up into the body feeling betrayed by us.
Yeah.
And then I think that on a deeper level, when we are in any kind of scenario where you can tell that somewhere there isn't full integrity or full transparency, I think it's incredibly anxiety provoking to us. And then also just the fact that anxiety is sometimes a distorted perception of what the future will bring or what is transpiring in that moment. And so, in a sense, like when we're jumping to conclusions and catastrophizing, we come by it honestly, it's understandable, but it is not the truth. I mean, the truth is, exactly this moment right now. And it's not that future that we're imagining and anticipating. And
Yeah.
so I think that I love this definition. I think that I could riff on it for 6 straight hours. I think it's really a helpful framing. It's
So we
beautiful.
buckle up. We're going to be here all night, right?
Long form podcast.
Yeah, and I like what you're saying. There's one of the things that came to mind as you were talking is little things we say almost every day. I know I should go to bed, but I shouldn't have this extra cup of coffee, but, right? I know I should probably get outside, but, and it's, again, you're not telling grandiose lies and fabricating this whole life for yourself. It's just these little ways of not meeting yourself where you're at, not listening to yourself, not being with yourself. We talked earlier about really being embodied, and I think most of us kind of live from the neck up. We glorify thinking. We're very, how many courses can you take, and make sure you take the notes, and what if I forget that, so I've got to write it down. And we're just so, like, I don't know, involved and invested with what we think, and getting into our body and seeing like these gut feels of what feels right. What am I like leaning towards or leaning away from? What feels cool, what feels warm to me? And these more subtle ways of just how much more honest could I get? And what would that do with my relationship with anxiety?
And I think you're talking about getting into the body and sort of dropping out of the head. And it makes me think of a friend of mine. She's a practitioner named Roya Darling. And she's so much sort of further down the path and more advanced.
Yeah.
And she really talks about how like we are so in our heads. Everything is so brain and intellectual. And like, can we drop into the heart? Like that's where the really powerful work happens.
It really is.
I'm like, oh, like I'm almost in an ironic way, like only intellectually appreciating that. Like I'm not fully embodied in that practice yet.
I hear you. It's the chasm, right, between knowing and having something kind of pinballing in your mind versus really like feeling it in your bone marrow and living and fully integrating that. Like the chasm there is enormous. And it's one of my yoga teachers talks often, Janet Stone, she talks about bringing your mind into your feet. And it's like, it doesn't really make sense, but it makes all kinds of sense. Right? That it's just like, get out of here and get into your body. And maybe we don't need, I've also heard one of my meditation teachers talked about how the mind is really good at things like driving a car and changing light bulbs, right? Doing algebra.
Thank you, brain.
Right. Thank you. All necessary. Pretty much everything else. Not for the mind, right? It's deeper in the heart, in the gut. Yeah. We could riff on this for a while. I wanted to just close. I thought this was a beautiful reminder, as we're really talking about shifting our relationship with anxiety, getting better, to better understand anxiety. You offered up these a few different ways of what we're moving towards. I talked earlier about we need to crowd out the focus and just like the kind of the gloom and doom we're like hanging out with anxiety and it's like, okay, what do we want more of? Like, right, let's put our attention there. And one of the things that you talk about is meaningful connection, right? Really. And of course, the kind of the underbelly of that is coming to terms with the messiness that is being a part of community. You're going to get the whole kit and caboodle when you engage in really meaningful community. But but how powerful that is, how valuable that is. And also engaging in really divine play and creation, and just giving ourselves this sense of, I mean, our most important resource as humans, right? Which is time. Expanding time, giving yourself the idea that time is more endless than we think, right? Than we treat it as. So I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit again, as this to close out of moving towards what we want, right?
Yeah, I mean, these are, I think, our fundamental human needs, but even in a more exciting way. Like, this is what makes this gift of being in a human body exquisite. And, whether it's just human connection and community, or connecting to nature, or having a sense of purpose and meaning in our lives, feeling like we're making a meaningful contribution, being in pleasure, being in play, and being of service, and just giving ourselves permission to ask the bigger questions. We're culturally on a bit of a rebound from that. Like, we maybe had a little bit more of a trend toward organized religion, and a lot of people are on a pendulum swing away from that. And I think perhaps we're ushering in a new era, which is permission to seek around it. No horse in this race in terms of what it has to look like, what you have to believe, but at least giving yourselves permission to explore that. And wherever you come out is cool, but don't close off the questions. And I think some form of personal spirituality, that's whatever is our truth, I think ends up being a pretty important balm for anxiety. And
I
so
love
I
that.
think I think a lot about that, especially like around grief, that
Mm,
when I ask the questions of sort of like, where is this person that I've lost, and do they still exist on some level, it gives me comfort, whether or not it's right, to feel that my mom still exists, that I can
yeah.
connect to her in spirit form. And so I find that having any sense of maybe, or that something vastly beyond our comprehension might be occurring here, for me, it softens the edges and makes loss a little bit less absolute. And for me, that's the ultimate salve for my true anxiety, because a lot of true
Yeah.
anxiety boils down to ultimately death or losing the people that we love. And with that worst case scenario, if we see that a purely material, cut and dry way, well, that's reason to be anxious. But
Right.
when we see it as part of something beyond our comprehension, and maybe that it isn't quite so straightforward, I get comfort from that. It certainly helps me show up a little bit more resilient in the face of those losses and challenges.
Yeah. And gosh, anything we can do to wiggle loose our grip on that all or nothing, black and white, just absolute binary thinking, and be more in that gray, I think too, of just wonder,
Mm,
right? Just being with wonder.
yeah.
Every once in a while, in this day and age, we can Google anything. And it's like, I wonder if, and somebody's already got their phone out. And I'm like, no, 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 no. I don't want to know. I really just want to wonder with it,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
just want to wonder. And then maybe in 15 minutes, somebody will come up with that actor or that song or that book, and we'll be like, yes. But having that sense of wonder, which is, it's something that's so far away from where we are and how we live our lives. So
Yeah.
engaging with connection and play, creation, as these are the ways to move. Like, here's what we're going to use to crowd out, right? The focus that becomes so thinking heavy. And even when we go down the path of really trying to transform anxiety, and we think we have to know it all and understand it all, and it's like, maybe we need to understand more and know more about where we want to go.
Mm.
So yeah, Ellen, we could talk forever. This has been such a great conversation. And again, if you're on video, you can see her gorgeous book, The Anatomy of Anxiety. I'll put links to all of this, of course, in the show notes. And this is out now and has been, and it's a very accessible read with a lot of great, chapter by chapter, you could pick it up wherever you wanted to start, really. There's so many different avenues and angles, and it was very helpful. to have some simple approaches and some like, here are things you're already doing. Tweak it and do this differently. Think about this differently. Introduce this, whether it's sleep, food, lifestyle, how you're living. You're already doing these things. Doesn't have to be complicated.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here.
Ellie, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor, and I enjoyed this conversation so much.
Likewise. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again.